You double check the numbers. You triple check because you just can't believe it. But there's no mistaking it. You have just won the lottery. And I don't mean a measly $5, $10 lottery. You've won big. $96 million. Now the question that countless reporters and your sudden vast amount of newly acquired friends will ask you is, what are you going to do? If you're like most Americans, you will quit your job. In fact, in a recent poll done in 2013, 70% of Americans say that if they won the lottery, they would quit their job. These numbers are extremely high, and it begs the question, why? Why is it that so many people would quit their job? I believe the answer to this is a fairly simple one. They're unhappy in their job. But this is just a hypothetical, not real. But the question still stands. What would you do? What if you so enjoyed your job that even after winning the lottery, you still wanted to come into work? I believe that the critical component that would keep you coming back is passion. Passion is a vital factor that must be considered when we are pursuing not just a job, but furthermore our calling from God. Now there are a few terms that need to be defined in order to have this discussion. One of them being calling itself. Now calling has two aspects of the word. There is first our salvific calling, which is where God calls us to himself in salvation. This is not the aspect I will be focusing on, but rather our outward calling, where God calls us outward to a place in the world. Our outward calling can be broken down further into our broad and specific calling. Broad calling is something that God gives to all people, and simply put, it is to love God and to love others. We see this in the Gospel of Matthew. But we still have our specific calling, where God has called each of us individuals to a specific place. The second largest term that needs to be defined is passion itself. Eric Ries, in his book Shape, defines passion as an empathy, attraction, or draw toward a group of people, a field of expertise, or a particular type of service. And this is the definition I will be using for passion. Now there are two final terms that need to be contrasted with each other. The terms of work and job. I want to draw a distinction between these two. Work will be defined as exertion put forth by a person, mental or physical, aimed at accomplishing a certain task. Thus, a farmer working in a field is doing work, or a student writing a 20-page thesis paper. I want to contrast this with job, whereas job is work done for compensation or pay. Now, before we begin, I want to put forward two counterpositions for passion. What I'm arguing against and what I'm not arguing for. These happen to coincide with two extreme views of passion. The first being where you cut out passion entirely from any consideration when pursuing our calling. This is what you might call, leads to what you might call the stereotypical American dream. Get the highest paying job you possibly can, buy a nice car, get as many vacation days as you can, and retire early. We see that this focus is purely selfish and is focused on money and ease. We see that both of these are an unbiblical approach to passion. We're told in Matthew 6 that man cannot serve God and money, and thus if money is our primary consideration when we pursue our calling, it is unbiblical. Second, we see in Colossians that we are told to work hard at whatever we do, and thus ease, despite what our popular culture tells us, is not what we should be pursuing. This is what I'm arguing against, the idea that passion must be cut out entirely. But I want to put forward what I'm not saying in this argument, that passion should be overinflated and put at the forefront of everything. This can lead to what you might call a follow your heart mentality. This is also a purely selfish idea and results in us pursuing things just based on what makes us happy. This also creates unrealistic expectations in our jobs. For when we think that our jobs will provide ultimate meaning and fulfillment, they always let us down. This can lead to job hopping and instability in our work, thinking that the next job will always be better, and thus we are unsatisfied in even good jobs that might otherwise have fulfilled us. So this is what I am not arguing for, that passion should be put at the forefront of everything, but rather passion should be rightly corrected to its place as a critical consideration in pursuing our calling. There are many reasons why people don't pursue passion. One of the biggest being fear. Fear of unknown, fear of failure, fear of others' expectations. But a correct biblical view of calling must include passion. Now, to answer questions about passion, we first need to have a biblical discussion of work itself. Firstly, we can look to Genesis to see that we are all made in the image of God. There are several implications from this, but the one I want to focus on is that we are all made to work. Despite what the world tells us today, work is not the enemy. Work is something that we were created to do, and we have a need that working fulfills. We see that God himself works when he created the world. And thus we are called to be imitators of God, and this is one reason why we are called to work. Another is that he explicitly tells us to work. We see that even before the fall, he tells Adam and Eve that they should work in naming all the animals. So work is a good thing, and not a curse. However, I do want to make sure I'm clear that work is cursed by the fall. And thus, we see that God tells Adam that his labors will produce thorns and thistles, as well as fruit. But work is something that we were all created to do. So now you might be asking, what is the purpose of work? Well, since our broad calling mentioned earlier is to love God and love others, then this is our purpose of our work. We are supposed to love God and love others. But how do we do this specifically in our lives? We can turn to the idea of service. We're told in Romans 12 by the Apostle Paul to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. Thus, all of our work should be presented in service to others and to God. This is how we show our love. This is the key component. But how do we serve specifically? All of us are called to serve, but we are obviously not going to serve in the same way. This is the idea of where our specific calling comes into play. The issue is God doesn't tell us what our specific calling should be. There's no roadmap that he gives us pointing us exactly where we should go, however much we might like that idea. One of the best ways I've found in my research when pursuing our specific calling is the book I mentioned earlier, Shape by Eric Ries. This was very appropriate, and I was actually introduced to this book by Mr. Cook in his chapel talks. SHAPE is an acronym that Ries uses that stands for Spiritual Abilities, Heart, Abilities, Personality, and Experience. These are 5 indicators that Ries says are critical when we want to pursue our specific calling from God. You'll notice that one of them is heart, which is the same word that I'm using as passion. Thus, passion, Ries puts forward as something that is critical when we pursue our calling. Another reason why passion is so important is because passion is a gift from God, and thus to be used. We see in James 1 that all good gifts are from God, and thus all passions, assuming they are biblical and not sinful passions, are passions that are from God and to be used. To not use our passions would actually be unglorifying to God. We see this in Matthew 25 in the parable of the talents. The parable goes, a master calls his servants to himself and gives them different amounts of money. He tells them to take the money and to go use it and multiply it for him. All the servants go and do so except one. One servant takes his amount of money and buries it in the ground. When the master calls his servants back to him, they are all rewarded except the one servant. He is rebuked and called wicked. Thus we see that we are called to be good stewards of the things God has given us, passion being one of them. To bury it in the ground, to leave it unused, is not to be a good steward of the things God has given us. We also can see from this that we all have been given a diversity of gifts and passions. Not everyone is the exact same. And thus we can see that Christians can and should be in all different areas of work. No one type of work is more important than the other. The garbage man on the street is just as important as the pastor in your church, because they are all doing their work in service for others and for God. We see an analogy of this that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians, where he talks about the body of Christ, where he uses the analogy of the body, talking about the hand and the foot and the eye, and how they are all critical components in the use of God's kingdom. Another reason why passion is so critical is because it brings a greater sense of fulfillment in our lives. Many have wondered that, is the Christian life really one that's supposed to be filled with joy and happiness? And we can turn to Jonathan Edwards for an answer on this. Jonathan Edwards was a theologian, and his answer was a resounding yes. Christian lives are supposed to be ones that are filled with joy and happiness. Jonathan Edwards speaks of a term called the good life. The good life, Jonathan Edwards calls, is a life that's lived for the glory of God. A life lived for the glory of God is a life that will bring us fulfillment and happiness. Thus we see that when we are living a life for the glory of God, we are actually called to use our passions. When we use our passions, we are living for the glory of God, and thus will have a greater sense of peace and fulfillment. This is related to the term of eudaimonia, as Emily mentioned earlier in her thesis. Eudaimonia means human flourishing. This is when a person is doing what they were created to do. He takes the analogy of a knife. Aristotle being him. Aristotle takes the analogy of a knife and says that a knife, when it's doing what it was created to do, is cutting things. And when it's doing it well, it's a sharp knife. The same is true of humans. When we're doing what we're created to do, we are actively engaged in human flourishing. We also have a peace that comes to us because we know that when we are pursuing our calling and trusting God, that we are where He wants us to be. We are following His commands and thus have a greater sense of peace and joy about our decisions that we make in our lives. There are also several practical reasons for why pursuing passion is a good idea. One is that when you love your job, you will actually tend to do it well, which is glorifying to Him. We see this, as mentioned earlier, in Colossians. That working hard is something God has called us to. And when we enjoy our job, it makes working hard all that much easier. This also creates passion in our jobs also creates a longevity in our jobs, thus negating the idea that passion will lead to job hopping and instability. We will actually, when we enjoy our jobs, want to remain in them, and thus have stability more in our careers. This also creates the idea that since pursuing our passion will be something that will be good for us, because since all of work is cursed, there are parts of every job, even ones that we enjoy, that will be hard and unenjoyable and unfulfilling. But when we enjoy our job, it fills us up, and thus makes those harder parts of the job that we don't enjoy more bearable, as opposed to a job that constantly drains us, and on top of that is something that we don't enjoy. Now I want to go ahead and say that I'm aware that there are several different objections to this. One of them being, we can look at the example of Jonah. Jonah was called by God to go preach to the Ninevites, something that he was not only not passionate about, but actively tried to avoid and had to be swallowed by a fish in order to get there. We can safely say that Jonah was not passionate about preaching to the Ninevites, but it was still his calling from God, and thus he was to pursue it and obey God's calling. Thus, we can see that every calling from God will not be one that is necessarily filled with passion. But I think this is more of an exception to the rule rather than a blanket statement for how we are to approach our calling. Some may also wonder that what if our passion just won't provide for us financially? This is a valid concern and is the case for many passions that people have. But we can turn to the example of Paul the Apostle for an answer. I think we can all safely agree that Paul's calling was to preach the gospel. But in instances where he was afraid that accepting money would cause other churches to reject Christ, he simply refused to take their money and instead turned to the vocation of tent making. Thus we can see that Paul pursued his primary calling to preach the gospel while still providing for himself financially in tent making. Now return with me again to imagine that you have just won the lottery. The question still stands. What do you do? Do you quit your job? Or what if you loved your job so much that you woke up Monday morning excited and ready to get to work? Thank you.